The storm outside had already taken 2 roofs and 1 bridge in the valley that night. Inside the barn, Ada Whitfield knelt in the straw with a lamb that had stopped breathing 30 seconds earlier, rubbing its chest with both hands, counting under her breath, refusing to accept what every rancher in 3 counties had told her that spring. 71 ewes, too old to breed. Sell them for mutton before winter takes them anyway. She had not sold them. And now, in the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade, with 40 lambs already on the ground and 30 more due before morning, she was about to find out whether one season of stubborn, careful work was enough to prove every one of those men wrong, or whether the cold would finish what their doubt had started. This is the story of how a flock nobody wanted became the reason an entire valley ate through the hardest winter in memory. Stay until the end, because the decision she made in week 3, the one her neighbors mocked her for, is the exact reason those lambs survived at all. 6 weeks earlier, the valley had looked very different. Ada Whitfield had inherited the ranch at Coldwater Ridge, the way most widows in that country inherited anything, quietly, without ceremony, and with far more debt attached to it than anyone had bothered to mention while her husband was alive. What she had, when the paperwork was finally settled, was 400 acres of high pasture, a barn in need of new siding, 2 children who still needed feeding through winter, and 71 ewes that every buyer in the valley had already priced as culls. The ewes were old. That much was true. Most had lambed 6, 7, 8 seasons already. Their wool had thinned. Their teeth, in several cases, had worn down to the gum line, a detail the neighboring rancher, a heavyset man named Delbert Voss, had pointed out to her with the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed being right more than he minded being unkind. "Those ewes are finished," he told her, standing at her fence line with his hat pulled low against the wind. "You breed them again, you'll lose half the lambs and half the ewes right along with them. Sell them for meat now, while they're still worth something, and buy young stock in spring." It was, by every conventional measure, sound advice. Ada thanked him for it and did not follow it. Not out of pride. She had done the arithmetic herself, sitting at the kitchen table after her children were asleep, and the arithmetic told her plainly that 71 ewes sold for mutton would not buy 71 young ewes come spring. Not at the prices the valley was paying, not with the debt she was already carrying. If she sold the flock, she would not simply be starting over. She would be starting with less than nothing. The only path that didn't end in ruin was the one nobody believed in. Breed the old ewes one more season, manage them with more care than anyone in the valley had ever bothered to give aging stock, and prove that too old was a judgment about neglect, not about the animals themselves. She began the following morning. Ada's first week was not spent breeding anything, it was spent watching. She walked the flock every morning and evening, the way her husband had taught her before he died, not counting heads out of habit, but reading each animal individually. Body condition, gait, the way each ewe held her head, the way she chewed or struggled to. What she found surprised her, though it shouldn't have. The ewes weren't failing because they were old. They were failing because they had been managed the way every flock in the valley was managed. Turned out on the same worn pasture, fed the same thin winter hay, expected to maintain body condition on grass alone in a season that gave them nothing extra to draw on. An old ewe with worn teeth cannot process rough, stemmy hay the way a young ewe can. She needs finer forage, softer cuts, feed that doesn't cost her more energy to chew than it returns in nutrition. A ewe that's been bred 7 times without extra mineral supplementation will be depleted in exactly the ways that make late pregnancy dangerous. Thin, weak-boned, prone to complications no young ewe would face at all. None of this required new stock, it required attention. Ada began sorting the flock by condition rather than by age alone. Not every 7-year-old ewe was equally worn, and 2 of the oldest animals in the flock were, by any honest measure, stronger than ewes half their age that had simply been bred too hard, too often, with too little rest between seasons. She separated the thin ewes into a smaller paddock nearer the barn, where she could feed them a supplemented ration, softer hay, a mineral mix she mixed herself from what she could afford, and for the very thinnest, a small daily portion of ground grain she could not really spare, but decided she would find a way to. Delbert Voss, riding past one afternoon, saw her carrying feed to what he called the coals and laughed without much malice, the way a man laughs at something he's certain will fail on its own without his help. Ada kept walking. Facts would speak before opinions ever could. By the second week, she understood that condition alone would not be enough. If she was going to breed 71 aging ewes and expect most of them to lamb successfully, she needed a system built specifically for animals with less margin for error than young stock. She started with the barn. The barn at Coldwater Ridge had been built for a smaller flock decades earlier. Its stalls narrow, its ventilation poor, drafts running along the floor exactly where a newborn lamb would need warmth most. She spent 3 days reworking it, packing straw bales along the lower walls to break the floor-level draft, hanging heavy canvas at the north-facing door where the worst wind entered, and building 4 small lambing pens from scrap lumber, each just large enough for one ewe and her lambs to bond undisturbed for the first critical hours after birth. She built a warming box in the corner nearest the stove, nothing elaborate, just a wooden crate lined with an old wool blanket, close enough to the stove's heat that a chilled newborn lamb could be revived there in minutes rather than lost to hypothermia in the open barn, a fate that claimed more lambs in that valley every year than any predator ever did. She kept a ledger, not out of any formal training, but because she had watched her husband keep one for years and understood, in a way Delbert Voss and men like him never seemed to, that memory is an unreliable tool and a written record is not. Every ewes condition score, every supplemental feeding, every date bred, every expected lambing date calculated forward from it. Her son Eli, 9 years old and quiet in the particular way of children who have already learned that winter takes things, began keeping the ledger with her in the evenings, copying numbers into neat columns by lamplight while his younger sister slept. It gave him something to hold onto besides fear. The breeding itself she managed with more care than the valley's convention allowed. Rather than turning the ram in with the full flock at once, the standard practice, fast and simple and entirely indifferent to which ewe was actually ready, she staggered the introduction across 10 days, watching each ewe's condition and cycling before allowing the pairing, spacing the eventual lambing dates so that no single week would demand more of her, or of the barn, than either could give. The first ewe was bred on the 9th day. By the 15th, most of the flock had cycled through. It still needed refining. She wouldn't know how much until the results came in. The valley's first serious cold arrived in the 4th week, well before any lambs were due. A hard frost that settled overnight and didn't lift by noon, the kind of cold that separates a flock managed with attention from one managed on hope alone. Ada moved the thin ewes into the barn full-time that night, checked the warming box, banked the stove, and sat up later than she meant to, watching for the specific signs of cold stress her husband had once taught her to recognize, shivering that didn't ease with movement, a ewe standing hunched and apart from the others, breath that came too fast for the temperature to explain. She found none of it. The system held. The supplemented ewes, stronger now than they'd been 3 weeks earlier, weathered the frost without incident. The 2 she'd separated as most fragile stood close to the stove-side wall she'd reinforced and came through the night no worse than the healthiest animals in the flock. She noted it in the ledger the way her husband would have, without celebration, only the specific brevity a person gives to a result that has confirmed a plan rather than surprised them. Week 4, first hard frost, no losses, no cold stress observed among supplemented ewes, system performing above expectation. Delbert Voss did not visit that week, but word travels in a valley that sighs regardless of who chooses to carry it, and by the fifth week, Ada noticed something she hadn't expected: a neighboring rancher's wife, a widow herself, arriving at her fence line not to mock the thin ewes but to ask, quietly, what Ada was feeding them. Ada told her. She was not a withholding woman. Knowledge kept quiet had never fed anyone through a winter, and a valley where every flock was managed with this much attention was a valley better equipped for whatever this winter intended to bring. By the sixth week, the first lambs were due within days, and the sky over Cold Water Ridge had taken on the flat, waiting quality that told anyone who'd lived in that valley long enough that something larger than an ordinary frost was building behind it. Ada read the signs the way she'd learned to read the flock, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of them. The way the ewes closest to lambing had grown restless 2 days earlier than her ledger predicted. The way the birds had cleared out of the low pasture entirely. The particular, sourceless stillness in the air that her husband used to call the valley holding its breath. She prepared as though the worst was certain, because in that country, the correct margin for an uncertain storm was always the full preparation. She doubled the barn's fuel supply. She moved every ewe within a week of lambing into the barn permanently, regardless of how crowded it left the space. She strung a guide rope from the house to the barn door, learned from a story her husband used to tell about a neighbor lost in a whiteout 30 yards from his own porch. She packed the lambing pens with fresh straw 4 inches deep, checked every hinge and latch on the warming box, and reviewed the ledger one final time with Eli by lamplight, making sure every expected date was accounted for. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The storm arrived on the 7th week, in the last hour of a gray afternoon, with a wind that came down off the ridge with no warning beyond the stillness that had preceded it by 2 days exactly. The first lamb came 4 hours into the storm, healthy, strong, and utterly unconcerned with the wind screaming against the barn's north wall. The second came within the hour. Then a third, born weak and chilled, carried immediately to the warming box while Ada worked to keep its mother calm in the pen beside it. By midnight, 7 lambs were on the ground, and Ada had not sat down once. This was the night the whole season had been built toward, though not in the way anyone watching from outside might have guessed. It wasn't a single dramatic act of rescue. It was the same discipline she'd practiced for 6 weeks, repeated now under maximum pressure, checking each ewe, managing the warming box, keeping the stove fed, recording each birth in the ledger even as exhaustion made every line harder to write than the one before it. Near 2 in the morning, the barn's north door, the one she'd reinforced with canvas weeks earlier, buckled under a gust strong enough to peel back one corner of the covering, and cold poured into the space where 4 lambs lay less than an hour old. She did not panic. She had, in the 3rd week of this whole endeavor, made the decision her neighbors had mocked her for, building a second, smaller enclosure inside the main barn specifically, because she had read enough about blizzards in that valley to know that a single barrier, however solid it looked in October, was not enough insurance against a wind that meant business in February. She moved the 4 newborns into that inner enclosure within minutes, sealed the outer door as best the storm allowed, and kept the stove burning through what remained of the night at a rate that would have emptied her fuel supply in half the time if she hadn't doubled it 3 days earlier. By morning the wind had not lifted, but the barn had held. 40 lambs were on the ground by first light. 30 more were still to come over the following days as the storm, in the strange way that blizzards sometimes do, settled into a long, hard cold rather than continuing at its opening ferocity. She lost 2 lambs in that stretch, not to the cold directly, but to complications no amount of preparation could have entirely prevented, and she recorded those losses in the ledger with the same steady hand she'd used for every success, because a true record does not hide its failures behind its wins. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. Of 71 ewes bred that season, 68 lambed. Of those, all but 3 delivered lambs that survived the storm and the weeks following it. Winter showed none. By early spring, word of what had happened at Cold Water Ridge had traveled the length of the valley, the way real results always do, faster and further than any advice ever could. Delbert Voss came to see for himself, standing at the same fence line where he'd once told her the flock was finished, watching more than 100 lambs move through the pasture behind ewes he had personally priced as culls the autumn before. He didn't apologize, not directly. Men like him rarely did. But he asked, this time, what she'd fed them, and Ada told him the same thing she'd told every other rancher who'd asked that winter, because a valley that survives a hard season survives it together or not at all. The lambs from Cold Water Ridge went on to feed families across 3 farms that spring, sold at prices no one would have predicted for a flock everyone had written off 6 months earlier, not because the ewes had changed, but because the attention paid to them had. Ada kept the ledger. She still keeps it, the story goes, updated now in a steadier hand than the exhausted one that recorded that blizzard's worst hours. A record of a season that started with 71 ewes nobody wanted and ended with an entire valley, eating a little easier through the hardest winter in a decade. The lesson wasn't that old ewes could still breed. Everyone who'd ever actually cared for a flock properly already knew that. The lesson was quieter and harder to sell in a single sentence to a man standing at a fence line in October. That too old is very often just another way of describing not given enough attention, and that the animals and the people written off first are sometimes the ones with the most left to prove. If this story moved you, imagine standing at that fence line in October, being told to give up on something everyone else had already priced for the slaughterhouse. Let us know in the comments, would you have taken the gamble Ada took, or sold the flock and started fresh? And if you want more stories of quiet, stubborn perseverance against a valley full of doubt, subscribe, because next week's story might be the one that changes how you see what too old really means.